You note, by the way, that I've said 8 subjects you need to know about. That's because originally it was called 8 things, but these things are so big that they're actually subjects in their own right. This is a vast topic, especially for me to cover in something like 25 minutes. So all I can hope to achieve is to give you a feel as to its breadth, and in particular, issues for you to consider, particularly if you're planning to get manufacturing done yourselves, issues that you want to think about in relationship to your own products. So the first question is make or buy. And even if you plan to make all of it, it's highly likely that you're going to be using contracting services, which I treat as part of the whole manufacturing process. So what to make or buy is the real question. These are decisions that you're going to have to make along the road. And unfortunately, although Lisa implied, we're not going to get the answers for your particular product this evening, but hopefully you'll have a sense of the considerations. Let's start. The first thing, and I want to try and take the first 3 items on this slide together. The first thing is your minimum viable product. Now what is a minimum viable product? Some people, or people regularly ask. And I say to you that it's the thing, we'll talk about the thing in a moment, which can prove the concept to a potential customer, and it's the thing that you're going to be able to use to carry out in relationship to customer development. And I'm using these phrases in relationship to a lot of writings, but in particular the writings of 2 guys who I hope many of you will have read, Eric Ries and Steve Blank. Ries talks about experimentation, and it's really, really important in those early days that you do experiment before you actually settle on your final product. And Blank, in his The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, talks about customer development. You need an MVP to actually enable you to actually get real feedback as to what your product should look like. And do remember, whatever you think it might be, the market might be giving you a totally different answer. So the ability to have something that you can use for that purpose is important. It could be something as simple, according to Ries, as a drawing. Certainly it could be a mock-up. It might be an animation, but most times it's going to be something that you will have rapidly prototyped. So it'll be a prototype of your product to prove the concept. So that's why I've written down rapid prototyping. I'm not going to go into all the details of how you might do your rapid prototyping, but clearly it could be anything from 3D printing yourself to actually making yourself, to actually going out to a turnkey supplier and getting them to make for you. Right early on, I've said, let's worry about metrics. There's a range of metrics that you need as a startup business, but some of the ones that become important when you're looking at the minimum viable product is get a sense of what the numbers are going to look like for that product when it goes eventually into production. So as you make it, try to think about what is the real assembly time for this, because that's going to be an important element of costs. Think about weight and volume, because they're going to impact issues around packaging, which we're going to cover a little bit later on. I've written down crowdfunding, not because crowdfunding is part of the MVP, but there are some interesting stories that relate to crowdfunding where people have suddenly had success hit them in a crowdfunding program. And they've tried to solve the problem of producing a large number of a product in a relatively short space of time themselves. And frankly, the advice is don't. Get help immediately if you're successful. Everybody says it's a great problem to have. There are some horror stories of how it's actually killed companies because they haven't got help in relationship to crowdfunding. The control issue, again, it's a subject of discussion. My own advice typically tends to be try and get the control as close to home as possible. Because if you're going to do what Ries said, which is experimentation, then you're actually going to go through a whole range of loops before you eventually arrive at what you think the product is going to be. The closer at home that you can do it, the better. Although I have to say that some people nowadays are using services that come out of an industrial park in Shenzhen in China, where all of the support services are around them and are actually enabling them to actually produce their rapid prototypes very rapidly. Also, in fact, if they actually get involved in crowdfunding and it's successful, who knows, you may even receive letters from people in Shenzhen who are going to say, we can help you out of the problem you're about to have. And finally, designer. Once you've got a sense of what your product is looking like, not enough people in Canada tend to use the services of an industrial designer. Really important if you're going to, certainly if you're going to think about a consumer product, but also pretty important because obviously appearance, etc. is important, but also industrial designers can not only design the appearance of the product, they can help you in design for manufacturing. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the acronym DFM. A lot of people nowadays, particularly put out by a major consultancy called McKinsey, are thinking about how you can design things where the product itself, when it actually becomes obsolete, can be recycled completely. And obviously, if you're in the business of making PCBs in what you're doing, then you're going to have to design with IPC in mind, in other words, with standards that are relevant to the boards themselves and the components that you're going to use. Okay, we've produced our MVP, we've gone out to the market, we've got some feedback from the market, we now know what we're actually going to want to produce. We're going to get into the situation where we want to start producing in volume. As you can see, this is a large slide in terms of numbers of items on it. I think there are 14. I never put 14 items on a slide. The reason that there are 14 here is because, frankly, I want you to get a sense of the number of things that you have to put together when you're producing the design package, which enables you to go out and actually get quotes for the product itself. The first item that I've got here is freeze. And the reason I say it is too often people want to continually develop their product whilst they're still going through the first production process. And the answer is you can't. You've actually got to get to the point where you stop and say, okay, that's going to be in the next version. There's going to be all sorts of pressures on you to try and modify things on the fly. But if you want to get a really good quote, and if you want to get into production quickly, the answer is at some stage you have to freeze. Okay, the next thing is design drawings. Not going to go into that. Everybody should be understanding what they need in their design drawings, and will probably these days be using some of the latest CAD/CAM software that's available for you. Once again, I mention overall dimensions because this is a checklist, and I'm asking you to think about the overall dimensions that you eventually arrived at because you're going to need them for other purposes. You need to understand the tolerances that you're going to offer with your product, and ideally, you should actually have checked the product out at each opposite ends of the tolerance ranges. You can do that during the MVP stage, but you've got to have actually got yourself clear on your tolerances when you actually get into the stage of having a design package. Think about ownership. And the reason I say about that is because if you make some decisions which mean that the product is going to go out, for example, on a turnkey basis, worry about the fact that you want to maintain ownership of the molds if you're going to produce them, that you may well want to maintain ownership of the test jigs, etc. So ensure that in any contract that you're doing, you're thinking about maintaining ownership, because you may well be going on to other suppliers later on. And it's important that you at least have ownership of those items, or else you're going to have to actually lay out significant sums of money for the next version that you're going to have to produce with your new client, or your new supplier, I should say. I've raised the subject here of animation, not because you need animation at this stage, but very often, if you've used CAD/CAM and you've got an animated version of it, it'll help you solve some of the problems, particularly if it's a moving product, that you can't often see. And so animation is really, really important if you've got that sort of a product. Think about the production processes that all of the components that your product may need, because that's going to affect a whole range of things. It's actually a subject in its own right. Choosing the right materials. What process you're going to use, which will affect the accuracy of the product itself, the tolerances, and the reliability. And don't forget, it's not just the client that's involved, that's interested in the eventual reliability of your product. Investors will be asking you about the reliability of your product, because that's one of the things that they tend to be extremely concerned about. I've talked about then the duty cycle and the MTBF. Duty cycle tends to be used when the product is going to be used intermittently, MTBF when it's going to be used on a more continuous basis. But you need to have a sense of those because it's also going to affect your maintenance strategy going forward. So it's at this point in time that you need to have a really good sense of both of those, or the one that relates to you. At that point, you're now in a position to produce a bill of materials. But don't forget also the assembly instructions. I'm talking about the assembly of putting the product together, not this when it's being assembled in the factory, not later assembly, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. So get the assembly instructions. And by the way, sometimes assembly instructions for the factory can affect just how well the product will perform. So it's an important area to worry about. Clearly, a big area is to concern yourself with is quality assurance and testing. And I'm talking about all sorts of different types of testing that may be necessary with your product. There may be vibration testing, there may be drop testing, ranges of different tests that may well be necessary before your product goes out into the marketplace. And finally, I put in inventory control. Not because inventory control is part of the design package, but some of the items that are related to it, relating to, first of all, your own forecasting of demand, but also the batch sizes that you'll actually be producing the product in and that you'll actually be getting quotations for. Also, you'll have to think about long lead times and high value items, both of which will become necessary in terms of your production process and often the costs associated with the product. Here's a slide on finding a manufacturing partner. It's something that somebody gave to me, and I want to pass on to you. I'm not going to go through it in detail. It's in the checklist that you actually have on your table, and it's an example of what you need, of the sort of thing that you need to do as you actually go through and check out and get costs, etc., for your product. So, we've got ourselves a design package for manufacturing the product. But manufacturing is not just producing a product. There's a whole range of other things that you need to worry about that surround the product itself. The first of these is certification. Your product, if you want to actually eventually be a large and successful organization, then you need to be thinking about the international opportunities right from the word go. And so the international requirements are part of what should be in your mindset when you start to think about the various sorts of certification standards, like the electrical ones, the mechanical standards, the health and safety standards. They may be, the standard that you may be applying may be fine here, in this case in Canada, but it may not be acceptable in other countries. And you need to be thinking about that if you actually are, as you actually want to plan yourself going forward. Particularly interestingly enough, if you've got a crowdfunding project where you may have had demand coming from a whole range of different countries around the world. And think also about the certifications that may be relevant to the type of product that you're making in the sort of market that you are actually selling. Because many organizations, particularly if you're selling to large organizations, will be asking you questions about the certification of your factories that are supplying your products. So think about those, such as ISO 9000, etc., as well. As I said, this is a broad subject, and it goes beyond just the product itself. Don't forget the packaging, and start thinking about the packaging really very early on. Think about the purpose of the packaging that you're producing. Is it for protection, just protecting the product just generally, or is it because it's going to have to stand a series of being bounced around from a transportation point of view? What materials do you want your packaging to be in? Is this a product that's going to actually sell into a consumer market where shelf appeal becomes a very important facet of the product? Are you going to have to add pieces of information onto the packages that enable people to be able to trace the particular product that was sold to them, like the lot size or the serial number? And is your product going to be a product maybe in its particular market, which might be a luxury market, where the actual packaging itself will not just be a material factor in terms of your success in selling it, it actually may be a material factor in terms of your overall pricing. I can give examples where, in fact, the product itself that I was involved with many years ago, where the product itself effectively cost nothing. Virtually the majority of the cost of the product was in the packaging itself. Think about as I've said, the design issue. Think about if you're going international, the languages, and where the languages are going to be applied in relationship to your product. If the product's going to be assembled by the client at the far end, think about the out-of-box experience. There's some great examples. If any of you have seen the Nest product, I think that's one of the great out-of-box experiences that you could have. And of course, most of you will have obviously recognized that Apple have paid a lot of attention to what the out-of-box experience is like. But Nest is the best example. You literally cannot go wrong once you open that box, right the way down to actually having the product actually running perfectly for you. So very, very important as well. Think about warranties and certifications and where you're going to apply them, how many languages they're going to be, are they going to be printed and put into the box, and how they're going to be provided to your clients. And then think about the printing. Is it going to be printed directly onto the container? Is it going to be through labeling? As I mentioned before, you're going to have to worry about lot sizes and serial numbers, and where's it going to be added? And finally, think about the printing itself. If you're going, for example, to Southeast Asia to have your product and maybe the packaging produced, do remember that for them, our language is just another set of graphics. Hey, that's what we think of their language. It's a set of graphics. We could easily get it wrong, and frankly, they easily get it wrong. And it's not unreasonable on their behalf to get it wrong. But nothing undersells, particularly a retail product, than poor lettering on the packaging, and certainly errors. Everybody notices them straight away. I want to now move on to the next big subject, which is getting the product from the factory to the user. The second item I've written down is to get everything to the port. I have examples myself of companies that I've worked with where multi-components have to arrive at the port on the same day to be shipped out. And if all the components don't arrive there, or if something happens, unfortunately, which causes one component to be late, the other N components are now a cost that you are bearing, a working capital cost that you are bearing until the last component arrives. Very important to make sure that you get your logistics right so that that doesn't happen. And particularly when I think about people who are getting product made in Asia, I think it's really important for them to think about the logistics just as much as they have to think about the manufacturing. You can have your product produced, it can be sitting there, but if it doesn't actually get to the port altogether, or at least in time for you, you could actually run into a whole series of problems. Then think about the shipping itself. Don't ignore duties. And don't ignore some of the tariffs that occur. There's an interesting example of people who were selling cameras, and part of the product when they suddenly found in a crowdfunding exercise was the selling of the camera back to various countries in the Far East where there was a significant demand. What happened with the product was that each of the countries that they were selling into slapped a massive duty on the product because they wanted to protect their own camera business in their own countries. Result is obvious. They suddenly found they were making losses as opposed to the profits that they were expecting. So worry about shipping, duty, VAT, etc. Obviously, once the products come over, think about if you're getting the product from elsewhere or it's been manufactured elsewhere, think about warehousing, inventory control. Also think about then the final fulfillment or delivery to the client. By the way, you can actually get direct fulfillment straight out of China if you happen to be manufacturing there. But fulfillment's really, really important. Don't forget your back office systems because they may well be being provided by logistics companies, which is great, but make sure that they interface into your back office systems that you're using for things like purchase ledger, inventory control as well, although the inventory control would typically be provided by the warehouser. And finally, even right up with the crowdfunding system, don't forget your RMA system. RMA stands for Return Material Authorization for those people who don't know. And that's really, really important because you get product that's been sent out to clients and there'll be problems with some of them. Statistically, there always are problems. You've got to get them back. You've got to get that product back. You need an RMA system to be in a position to do it. Have it prepared for yourselves. Think about it early on. I want to move on now to targets. I could have put targets, or forecasting possibly would have been a better word, at any stage in this thing. But it's really starting to think about costs. Make sure that, remember, all of the stuff that you're forecasting is going to form part of your business plan. So make sure that you have a sense of the costs that you're doing, and that those costs are targets that you're actually working with your suppliers towards. Worrying, I mentioned before, about lead times. That's going to affect your costs as well. And worry if you're getting your product produced, think about, when you're negotiating for it, think about the upfront payments that you're going to have to make. They're going to be significant costs when it comes to financing, and you've got to remember upfront payments. And WIP, which is really this whole issue of the costs that you are bearing whilst the product is going through. It shouldn't have been under terms and conditions, should have been outdented a bit, but that's also extremely important when it comes to your overall financing. So, as I said, the first item and the last item are very much the same. You're having to think about making which parts, all or part of it. If you're going to subcontractors, you've got to actually go through the process of selection. And that's why I've said, get an experienced project manager. That experienced project manager may be somebody who's inside your business, which is great, or it may be a consultant, which is necessary. Or if you're going to actually have your product produced on a turnkey basis, they may provide that as part of the service from your point of view to you. They'll project manage on your behalf. You may, however, decide that the volumes that you're going to sell require you to multi-source. So think about multi-sourcing. It's a way of providing an extra level of safety. Where do you want to have this product produced if you're in the control of the situation? I mentioned my advice would be tending to have the MVP produced locally. But is that where you're going to produce the final product? So it'll vary. It could well be that you start locally at some point in time, and you have to define that. It's going to move to other places in the world. You've got some choices under subcontract. You could decide to assemble it yourself. You could fit into part of the process, or as I've indicated a few times, you could use a turnkey supplier. And there's some great turnkey suppliers around who will take off many of these issues off your shoulders and take it on their shoulders. Of course, it bears a cost associated with it. They have to make a profit too. But also do remember that there's not just the cost of the cost, there's also the cost of ownership that I mentioned before, of some of the items associated with switching off that particular supplier. So here's another subject in its own right, which is if you make that decision to go to Southeast Asia and have your product produced there, you can organize it yourself. My advice these days is, okay, if you speak Chinese really well, if you understand the culture that's operating today, then yes, think about it. But there are now companies and organizations that have set up where in your local country, in our case here, you'll have somebody who both speaks and understands Chinese, and they are directly connected to people on the ground, for example, in China. And having somebody on the ground in China is important, not just from the manufacturing, making sure that the orders get started, making sure that if issues arise that they can be resolved locally, making sure that the logistics happen as they're supposed to. Those sorts of organizations exist, and they, again, can take off some of the major problems off your shoulders. So, bottom line, I guess from all I've said today is get advice on those things that you don't feel that you know everything about. Advice is necessary. But finally, don't forget about the power in numbers. A lot of people sitting in this room, even just this evening, those people each will have different issues that they've learnt about, and that there'll be issues that you know about. If you can get some groups together, you can actually learn a lot directly from each other. And that's really, really important. There is a real power in numbers. And who knows, if you're using some of the same suppliers, you maybe even get the power of numbers of actually being able to negotiate.